thank you very much for coming on this beautiful August afternoon. Let me share with you for about 15 to 20 minutes what this book, From Times Square to Timbuktu, tries to share and tell. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers and interchange. And I want to say at the outset how grateful I am to Eerdmans Publishing and to the staff there, some of whom are here now. They've been just terrific to work with. Eerdmans is a company that's owned by people who believe that they like to publish good books. And that is not true of all publishing companies today. And it's great to be able to work with Eerdmans. We are living today in one of the great shifts in the history of Christianity. There has been the most dramatic transition of Christianity geographically in the last 100 years than has ever occurred in the life of Christian faith. There are several ways to describe this. Most easily to look at what's happened in the last 100 years. In 1910, 80% of all Christians were in Europe and North America. By 2010, that figure had changed to 40%. When you look just at those who identify as evangelicals, it was 90% of all evangelicals were in Europe and North America in 1910. Today, only 25%. You look at continents, especially the continent of Africa, which in 1910 had only 2% of the world's Christians. 100 years later, an astonishing story of growth means that today, 1 out of every 4 Christians is an African. There are 494 million African Christians. That figure will grow by 2025 to approximately 644 million. And that will mean that between Africa and Latin America, you will have more than 1 billion Christians. In Latin America today, Brazil now is the country with the largest number of Catholics and also the largest number of Pentecostals. Now, this shift has occurred not only in Africa and Latin America, but increasingly also in Asia. Today there are 350 million Christians in Asia. In China, it is reliably said that on any given Sunday, there are more Chinese in Christian congregations than there are in the United States. Overall, in Asia, the Islamic community, Muslims, have grown the most over 100 years. There are 1 billion Muslims in Asia. But in the last 10 years, Christianity in Asia has grown by 2.4%, and Islam by only 1.7%. So Christianity has actually grown faster in Asia than the Muslim tradition has. All this means that you now see Christianity as dramatically changing its place in the world. It's possible to measure the spot on the world where there are an equal number of Christians to the north and the south and the east and the west. And demographers have done this since the start of Christianity. It's called the statistical center of gravity of Christianity. 100 years ago, in 1910, that was in Spain. From 1910 to 2010, that statistical center moved all the way down to a point near Timbuktu in Africa. The most dramatic shift that has happened in 2,000 years of Christian history. Now, those facts have been told by others and are increasingly being known. I wanted to write this book in order to explore 2 questions. What does all this mean for the global witness of Christian faith as we look to the future? And secondly, what does this mean for local congregations right here in North America? So what are the global implications of this? And then, what does it mean locally for the congregations that you and I attend? But we look at the picture globally. The first thing we have to understand is that Christianity is now a non-Western religion. Most Christians in the world today have shaped their faith and expressed their faith in non-Western contexts, which means that the familiar framework that you and I have grown up with, the framework of the Enlightenment that has been behind Western culture and been for so long the comfortable cradle of Christianity, now no longer is the predominant way in which Christianity is shaped and understood around the world. The second thing to understand is that Christianity has become tremendously fragmented in this process. In writing the book, I did research into the number of denominations that exist. I was curious about this, and finally found people who actually keep track of this. The total they have come up with, and you could find it on a website, is that today in the world there are 43,800 separate denominations. The website concludes with a note, please pray for Christian unity. And that fragmentation is also expressed in the ways in which different parts of the Christian family remain institutionally isolated from one another. I'll give you a good example. On Saturday, this coming Saturday, I have the privilege of flying to Malaysia, to Kuala Lumpur, for the Pentecostal World Conference. This is a conference of Pentecostals that happens once every 3 years, gathers about 4,000 or 5,000 people. I'm going there as part of an ecumenical delegation from the Global Christian Forum. Now, in about 2 months after that, the World Council of Churches will gather in their 10th assembly in Busan, South Korea. And it will gather about 4,000 to 5,000 people for that occasion. It's fair to say that the number of people who will be at both events, I and my colleagues will be amongst that number, are probably less than 100, and maybe even less than 50. Because these two worlds are fully separate from one another. Thus, one of the realities we're faced with globally is the urgent need to build new bridges between the divided parts of the Christian family. The organization I've mentioned, the Global Christian Forum, is one avenue that is attempting to do so. The other reality, when you look at it globally, is that we're faced with a situation in which the resources, the money, and the theological capital of Christianity continues in the global north. Simply look at the centers of Christian organizations. The World Council and other ecumenical organizations are in Geneva. World Vision is in California. The Anglican Communion is in London, on and on. All the organizations and institutional resources are centered in the global north, while the vibrancy and the future and the predominant number of Christians and their churches and denominations are now flourishing in the global south. All the more reason to find ways in which to bridge this major divide. Now, what does this mean, not only globally, but what does this mean locally? And here, what you come to see is that the global is becoming truly local. People have invented a phrase, in fact, it's called colloquial. The combination of the two would drive Tom Robbie and other editors nuts, these newly invented words. But what is happening globally is being experienced locally. And that is occurring primarily through patterns of migration. Listen to this. There are 214 million migrants in the world today. People moving from one country to another, either being forced to for reasons of war or persecution, or desiring to, better themselves or get education or a better life. Of those 214 million, 105 million are Christians. A far higher proportion than the number and percentage of Christians in the world. There are some people who remind us, and Jehu Hensel's, one of the authors who's worked in this area, says it the best. Every Christian migrant is a potential missionary. And the movement of Christian faith throughout the world today is happening primarily not through established missionary organizations, but through migration. Through migration. You look at the pattern as it has affected the United States. The Hispanic population in the United States today is 50 million. Of that number, an overwhelming majority are Christian. 70% of that number are Catholic. It means that even today, the Roman Catholic Church in the United States is 35% Hispanic. In some cities, such as Los Angeles, that figure is as high as 70%. Moreover, Catholic Hispanics, when they characterize their own faith, 54% of Catholic Hispanics call themselves charismatic. So they are bringing to that tradition their own sense of faith and understanding that's been shaped by non-Western cultures, particularly in Latin America. There, additionally, however, are 23% of those Hispanic immigrants who are Protestant. And that is no small number. It's actually 9.5 million, which means there are more Protestant Latinos in the United States than there are Episcopalians. And Protestant Latinos are increasingly having an important effect within the Protestant and evangelical landscape. Many major organizations now, in fact, there are 3 large organizations of Hispanic Protestant Christians active in advocacy and evangelism. You look to the Asian American community, there are about 17.3 million Asians now in the United States. This has been a dramatic increase since the last time there was major immigration reform, which was in 1965. Those of you who might remember that history was the Hart-Celler Act that reformed our immigration system at that time. Now, in these very weeks, we're in the middle of deciding how we might reform our immigration system again. That immigration reform in 1965 set into motion a whole set of movements which have made the United States by far the most religiously diverse place in the world. Most people, when you say immigration or immigrant, will think either of a person who's here illegally or without documentation, or will think of a Muslim. The truth is that we have 43 million immigrants, meaning persons who were born in another country and are now living in the United States. 43 million. Of that 43 million, 74% are Christian. 5% are Muslim, 4% are Buddhist, and 3% are Hindu. Which means that immigration has by far had the most dramatic effect on the Christian community within the United States. And it's introduced into our midst a wide variety of expressions of Christian faith. Expressions that come from traditions different from those who have dominated in our own culture. We were mentioning Asian immigration, and what you note there is that of Asian immigrants, about 44% are Christian, which is a higher percentage than what is represented in their countries of origin. And of that number, a large percentage are Chinese. Many Chinese immigrants, in fact, go through experiences of conversion when they come to the United States, as happens also with other immigrants. The sociologists who study this this whole phenomenon and say that the process of immigration nearly always deepens the faith of those who are immigrants. So you have a growing number of Asian American immigrants in our country. Of the different ethnic groups, Asian Americans are growing faster than any other, 46% in the last decade, which means by the year 2025 there will be 40 million Asian Americans in the United States, and perhaps half of those Christian. You already see the impact of that within the U.S. religious scene. Fuller Seminary, for instance, 1 out of 5 students there now is Asian American. Finally, you look at African immigrants. The numbers are much smaller, but yet the countries such as Kenya, Ghana, Ethiopia, and Egypt, as well as Nigeria, send large numbers of immigrants to the United States. I was recently in Washington, D.C., and whenever I'm in cities now and taking taxi drivers, I always talk to the taxi drivers. It's provided me with some of my best research. I had 3 taxi cab rides in D.C. All 3 taxi cab drivers were from Ethiopia. So I started talking to them about their colleagues and their fellow Ethiopians, and I asked each one if they were religious. Oh yes, they were Christian. Where did they worship? It turns out that in the Washington, D.C. area, from how people can best estimate, there are 250,000 Ethiopians. There are 35 Ethiopian Christian churches in the Washington, D.C. area. And most of these are under the radar and out of the normal attention and awareness of American Christians. You go to Minneapolis, St. Paul, and you will find that there are 73 Asian American congregations in the Minneapolis, St. Paul area, 67 African immigrant congregations in the Minneapolis, St. Paul area alone. One of the books done here at Eerdmans is Word Made Global by Mark Vornick. He studied 3 African immigrant congregations in New York. There are easily 150 such congregations in New York alone. But this trend is not only in the big cities, it's in cities like ours here in Grand Rapids as well. With Joel Carpenter at our church, we did a little exercise in a class, some of you I think were in it, that said, let's try to identify how many immigrant congregations there are in the Grand Rapids area. We came up just informally with 22, from Korea, from Vietnam, from Sudan, from Kenya, from Nigeria, simply in the Grand Rapids area. You go to the census data, you'll see that 16% of households in Grand Rapids speak a language other than English. So the kinds of trends that I'm describing are ones that are at our doorstep if we would but notice and understand. This presents great challenges to congregational life. There are 350,000 congregations in the United States. Only 6% of those are truly multicultural congregations. And by calling a congregation multicultural, it's one where there is a group other than the majority of at least 20%. That's what a sociologist would say begins to make something genuinely multicultural, not just a few people who are different. The need for Christian hospitality, understood in the deepest biblical sense, I think, is the greatest challenge that's going to face U.S. congregations as we look into the future. The Bible tells us in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, to be alert and aware of the stranger in our midst 36 times. It tells us to love our neighbor once. The understanding of the importance of welcoming the stranger has been central to to the Judeo-Christian tradition and becomes so much more essential for living out our life now in this time. The struggles for becoming a multicultural congregation are real and difficult. It is not easy to do. But it's essential that we develop more and more models in light of the developments that are changing the shape of Christianity in North America. And why it's so important is that the voices of world Christianity now find themselves speaking to be heard within our own communities. And we have the opportunity of bridging those major gaps that characterize all of world Christianity, of building bridges of fellowship and unity right in our own communities. That's the new situation that I believe God has brought into our midst. There are three questions that I at least would leave us with, and that I try to explore in the course of the book. The one is this: what does it mean for churches in the U.S. to no longer be at the center of world Christianity? Because we're not. What does it mean that Christianity has now become a non-Western religion? Secondly, when we look at the growth of Pentecostalism, 1 out of every 4 Christians in the world now is Pentecostal. And look at the growth of highly indigenized expressions of faith in the 2/3 world. What's the social and economic impact of those communities in the countries where they are? It's a very important question. There are a lot of stereotypes. There's just beginning to be deep and illuminating study around that question. But I think that's also of very deep importance. And the third and last question is, what if it is the case that God's mission in the world is actually accomplished through migration? What if it's the case that the mission of God is being driven today, and in fact, I would argue, has often been driven through history, not by the various plans and schemes and movements, but has actually been driven by the ways in which Christians find themselves on the move, wandering from one country to another. I think, in fact, that's the way in which the mission of God primarily is being spread within the globe today. But those are 3 questions that, amongst many others, that I think are raised by what I've tried to share in the book. I hope that gives you a little aperitif, a little appetizer to what the book has in store, and I thank you for the generosity of your time. Nate?
If you have any questions, we'll use the microphone so we can...
I just read a little piece by an Episcopalian priest who said that the command to go into all the world and make disciples, go into all the world and preach the gospel, that instead of thinking out somewhere else, like in Siberia or a remote part of Japan or so, we need to think about the fact that the world is right at our doorstep. God has placed us in this corner of the world, this 3 square feet, so to say, and we need to make disciples right where we are. How do you react to that in light of your research?
I would not only agree with that in reflecting on how patterns of migration have now brought the world to our doorstep, but I'd take it a step further, John. I'd say, what would it mean if we regard those Christians who have come into our midst through migration as God's missionaries to us? And could it be that the patterns of migration from the global south to the U.S. and also to Europe, where the story is even more dramatic. Could it be that this is part of the plan of God's mission in the world? And that we should think in a whole different way about those who are in our midst. One of the reasons why establishing multicultural congregations is so difficult is that the first impulse is to simply form a congregation where those of us who are dissimilar say we welcome others, as long as you fit into how we are. One of the theologians I read in doing the book wrote about the experience of the church in Acts when the church grew in Antioch and then there was the famous Council of Jerusalem and the conflict that ensued. And he said what the church established was a non-assimilation policy. You think about this. A Gentile in Antioch did not have to become a Jew in order to become a Christian. Now that seems simple to us, but at the time it was radical, because what it really means is that the experience of another from a different cultural and ethnic background and all that they bring in their apprehension of faith has its own legitimacy. It has to be seen as a gift to us. That, I think, will be the real challenge of North American congregations.
Could you?
He's got a mic back there, so he'll
Go here.
You're next.
My question is, how best do we in our churches learn to listen to other people? What are the pillars that we maintain in our picket fence as our important foundational beliefs? And how do we learn which little pickets are cultural or situational? Out of about 65 to 70 people in our basic English worship on Sunday, we had at least 16 different countries represented. That's a lot of different voices. How do we learn to listen?
Yeah, I think, Helen, that is one of the central questions, and I don't think that there are any easy answers. I do think that there are a series of steps that congregations who are genuinely trying to make a commitment in this area might consider going through. And one of them is simply listening to the stories of pilgrimage of faith from one another. Really taking the time to listen to how another has come into their experience of faith and to share that together. In the Global Christian Forum, in which we gather in different global settings, those from Pentecostal, Evangelical, Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and historic Protestant backgrounds, many of them church leaders. We begin every consultation by taking the time, and sometimes this is a day, in which each person in a group of maybe 20 or so has the opportunity to share their story of how they have been led by God to this point in their faith journey. And simply doing that creates an entirely new sense of community where barriers are broken and the opportunity to see faith through the journey of another becomes alive. So I think that at a minimum is necessary when you ask how do we really listen to one another. We've got to create the space and time to share one another's stories and to do that locally as well as to do that globally. Ralph, had a question.
Couldn't it be argued that migration of Christians has actually weakened Christianity, with all the Christians moving out of Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, all these countries are coming here and leaving the church altogether in these countries? Well, these countries are becoming more solidly Islamic.
Yeah, you can argue, and certainly this is a deep concern of Christians who are in the Middle East. Any of the Christian friends whom I've talked to from Middle Eastern churches, their first concern is we are losing living Christian community within the Holy Land and within this region of the world. So it's true that migration sometimes has a negative effect on the country that's left. But God works, I think, in very mysterious ways, in ways that usually defy our normal calculation. Some of you might remember, Ralph, when at the time of the Chinese Communist Revolution, all the missionaries were thrown out of China. And the general consensus was that the efforts to plant Christianity within that country were now lost. And yet you see today, the greatest resurgence of Christianity in Africa initially was in Korea, but in the last 20, 25 years has been in China, in ways that never could be expected or scripted. And so I think there's a mysterious way in which patterns of migration end up with consequences that can't be fully seen or apprehended in the present time. Although I certainly acknowledge the danger that you raise.
I'd like to pursue that a little bit further. I've long been troubled by the fact that North Africa, of course, was the center of Christianity at one time, obviously, and all the rest of them. And of course, you'd be hard-pressed to find a Christian in Libya, Morocco, and Nigeria. Now, and I know Andrew Wells deals with that in his book and talks about God losing, as you were saying, but I'd still, I guess, like to see you help set my mind a little bit at ease about that. But I mean, that happened 1,500 or whatever years ago. But that's a similar thing that we see happening perhaps in Syria and other cases. And I guess I'd like to see you deal a little more with my concern on that.
No, I don't know, Chuck. I mean, it's a very real concern. I was with Andrew Walls in Ghana in November. It's the first time only I've been able to talk with him. His overview was fascinating. He said that the current world order has been shaped by patterns of people who have moved out of Europe to other places around the world, and to the United States, etc. And that now the world order is being reshaped by the movement of people from outside of Europe back to Europe and to the United States, and elaborated that thesis, which is, when you think of it, is pretty compelling. It doesn't. I saw on the news last night increasingly number of Syrians who are fleeing Syria. Many of them Christian. Now, interestingly, some of them are actually going to Iraq. Others are going wherever they can. And we typically haven't recognized in the West that within countries like Syria and Egypt, there have been minority but yet very important Christian communities, 10% of the population or so, that within autocratic governments have had a relatively safe and stable existence. And the turmoil there now, it certainly raises anxiety about the security and the future of those Christian communities. So I'm not sure I can ease our anxiety, but can point out to the overall dynamic of the way in which migration from African and Asian countries back to Europe, and I haven't talked much about dynamics in Europe, are really creating a whole new situation of some real hope. On any given Sunday in London, I think it's 56% of those who are in worship are non-white today. And the resurgence of much of Christianity within large European communities is being fueled by immigrant Christian populations. And in the same way, we're in the middle of an immigration debate here. If it were possible, and it's not, but if it were possible to deport the 11.5 million immigrants who are here without proper documentation, you would be robbing, especially the Catholic Church, of a great deal of its religious vitality. The only reason why the Catholic Church has not declined in the U.S. is because of patterns of immigration. So I think one of the untold stories in the whole immigration dialogue is the role of immigration in fueling and really enriching the religious diversity within our own country, and particularly the diversity of the Christian community.
Any more questions? One. That'll be the last one then.
Privileged position, maybe I can make sure I get 2 questions in. One request is, what about that segment of the population that identifies themselves as spiritual but not religious? They don't fit into the categories of religious groups that you had mentioned, Buddhists and so on and so on. Is that at all a significant portion of enough to take notice of it?
Yeah, it's a significant, but it does not apply primarily to those who are within the immigrant population. The spiritual religious, applies mostly to our kids, to people who are well established in our culture and who are deciding that they're not quite sure they like established religion, but they do think they're spiritual, and that number is growing. In fact, the number who will call themselves now agnostic in some form, or will put themselves in that category, is up to 20%. The so-called nuns are one of the fastest growing features within the American religious landscape. But what I would normally say is that a lot of the popular commentary that points to that trend, and that basically says Christianity in the United States is declining, young people aren't going to the church, church is losing members, all denominations are declining. All that is true. But what is not said is that, in fact, religious life within the United States is being infused by immigrants who are worshiping in mono-ethnic congregations, who are wanting to worship with other Christians unlike themselves, if they could find multi-ethnic congregations that were hospitable, that are bringing new religious vitality to the American Christian scene, but who generally are off the radar and don't get counted when people talk about the trends of those who are leaving
traditional Christian. Get a second. Just any comment you want to make on the election of Pope Francis?
Yeah, the election of Pope Francis is just, I don't think we recognize how titanic and major a step this is for the Catholic Church. I have a very close friend who was with the U.S. Catholic Conference who said to me, if you wrote a script, and the script was an established pope suddenly decides to resign, and then there's a conclave, and then they choose a pope not from Europe, and he takes the name of Francis and starts washing the feet of the poor and of Muslims. The person considering this would say, "I'm sorry, that'll never make a movie." I mean, from the perspective of my Catholic friends, what has happened is almost unimaginable. The first time in 1,200 years that a non-European pope has been elected. And when you see the things that Francis is doing, his talk about the poor, and his desire to live and model a more simple way, and his very radical talk about economic justice, what you're simply hearing is the voice of Christians from the global South. And it wouldn't be much different if you were talking to evangelicals. I saw a survey the other day that said evangelicals in Brazil, when asked the question, should the government provide enough to eat and a place to live for every citizen, 96% say yes. One of the other dynamics that we don't understand is that those who are formed in the global South defy the convenient categories of liberal and conservative that dominate our religious landscape. And we continue to try to import those categories on them. And they don't work. And we're not learning from them as a result.